Okay, and go.
Internet has become a crucial part of everyday life, but often it can feel like your connection is too slow and too expensive.
I've seen it dip to about 1 megabit per second, and that usually happens right around the time I have to download a huge file for work.
Open Technology Institute's research confirms the frustration.
In the US pay more for slower internet than people abroad. So for many consumers, the cost of getting online right now is simply too high and also too complicated.
And there are a lot of stakeholders adding to the confusion.
It's not like you just connect a wire to your house and then you have magic access to the cloud. It takes a lot of infrastructure and wires and cables and networks to get data from your house to the rest of the internet.
Our Wi-Fi is run through the company that owns this apartment. We don't get to see what our Wi-Fi speed is supposed to run at or alter our plan at all.
Really have no idea how pricing for internet service works in this country. We don't really know what will show up on our bill at the end of the month, given the kinds of fees that companies can lobby on us.
At the same time, there are still Americans who lack access to affordable, reliable broadband.
One of the striking differences that's persisted over time is that people in the suburbs are much more likely to have internet access and broadband access than rural residents.
Lawmakers are trying to address the issue. For a long time, infrastructure policy didn't include internet access, but new legislation shows that perspective is shifting. The U.S. Senate passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act in August 2021, which includes $65 billion to expand high-speed internet access. But the House of Representatives has yet to vote on the bill, and even if there is change coming from Washington, it'll take a long time for that to reach our computers and routers. Here's why so many Americans lack access to high-speed internet, why those who can get it are paying more for slower speeds, and some ways policymakers can fix it. The cost of high-speed internet in the US is difficult to measure.
The government does collect some cost data, but it's incomplete. It's not perfect. The government also tries to collect access data. That is also incomplete. I think the FCC has been under a lot of pressure to get this right. And I think that there are some good, smart people at the agency working on this, but we don't have it yet.
Some researchers are working to fill the gap in the data. The Open Technology Institute, or OTI, has been studying the price and speed of internet services advertised within the United States as well as abroad.
We found that the current average advertised monthly cost of internet in the United States is $68.38, so almost $70, which is higher than the average price of internet for all of North America, Europe, and Asia. And we also found that the higher costs don't necessarily translate to faster internet. People in the US pay more for slower internet than people abroad. So for many consumers, the cost of getting online right now is simply too high and also too complicated.
One thing that's difficult about comparing prices in the United States is that different geographic regions have very different cost structures. Right? It can be very different to deploy broadband in downtown Los Angeles as it is in Montana.
Actual internet speeds are also difficult to pin down, and they sometimes don't match advertised speeds.
There is a system in place right now where companies self-report the speeds that they offer, but oftentimes those speeds that they report differ from the speeds that consumers actually experience.
Another study out of Berkeley Law also found inconsistencies when it came to internet speeds.
One town in Minnesota, one side of the street, you pay $50 a month, and your download speed is 60 megabits per second. On the other side of the street, you pay the same price, $50 a month. Your download speed is 3 megabits per second. That's not enough to stream live TV on Hulu. And so what we find is that competition plays a big role in improving consumers' broadband experience.
Any number of folks we talk to say that they've hunted around. They've looked for vendors, they've looked for opportunities to get low-cost access, and some of them have just given up in frustration because they don't feel like it's available to them.
Our research has consistently shown prices for internet service remain high. The federal government should be the one collecting this data from companies. Like, how does the price change? How does this quality change year after year?
Increasing availability to high-speed internet can lead to economic growth, according to an April 2021 report from Deloitte. It found that a 10 percentage point increase in broadband access could have resulted in more than 875,000 additional U.S. jobs in 2014, as well as $186 billion more in economic output in 2019. The report also found that higher speed internet would likely lead to, quote, noticeable improvements in job growth.
When we ask Americans about the advantages of broadband, what is so clear from broadband users is that they think that broadband makes them better citizens, makes them better workers, makes them better consumers, makes them better political and civic actors, makes them better news consumers. And they kind of worry about the people who don't have access to broadband, that they aren't necessarily full participants in all of the dimensions of society.
A 2016 study by the Council of Economic Advisors also found that improving access to broadband leads to economic gains, such as improving labor market outcomes for subscribers, increasing economic growth, providing access to better healthcare, and enhancing civic participation.
Some of the striking things, though, that happened during the pandemic, though, was that as many school children went to remote learning, we heard from a lot of low-income families that their kids were struggling because they didn't have high-speed connections at home. They had to do homework on a cell phone. They often had to go outside the house to a local food spot to get access to Wi-Fi. So almost half of the low-income families said that they were struggling with at least one of those issues related to the homework gap during the pandemic.
Stanford University's Policy Analysis for California Education has documented how student learning has declined during the pandemic, especially among younger children. Its research has also found that low-income students were substantially more likely to fall behind than higher-income students.
If someone is still in junior high or elementary school, and you disrupt his or her education, you're never going to really make up for that. And then the other thing is graduates who enter a bad labor market. We actually know about that from a number of studies, suffer permanent damage to their career prospects.
So there are several factors that contribute to the high cost of internet service in this country. One of the most important reasons is the near monopoly in the marketplace. The US market for internet service is dominated by just a handful of companies. Because of this, none of them feel any market pressure to lower the cost or improve the quality of their service.
At least 49.7 million Americans only have access to broadband from one of the 7 largest cable and telephone companies, according to an analysis of the FCC's broadband competition data by the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, or ILSR. ILSR says that at least 83.3 million Americans can only access broadband through a single provider. The report also concluded that Charter Communications and Comcast, which is CNBC's parent company and the largest internet provider in the country according to the FCC's data, maintained a monopoly over at least 47 million people with their coverage spanning mostly urban and suburban areas. ILSR's analysis found that roughly 52 million households subscribe to either Comcast or Charter. Charter told CNBC it's extending its broadband network into, quote, unserved and rural areas, and it offers lower cost options for eligible families and seniors, as well as different packages for K-12 schools. Comcast did not respond to CNBC's request for comment.
Competition makes a big difference. Consumers that only have one choice for broadband provider can pay 5 times more.
Yeah, we only got one
consumers that have the benefit of competition.
The ILSR report also says that, quote, big telecom companies have largely abandoned rural America. Data out of the Pew Research Center reflects a rural-suburban divide.
One of the striking differences that's persisted over time is that people in the suburbs are much more likely to have internet access and broadband access than rural residents. That gap has shrunk over the years. A lot more people in rural areas now have home broadband than had it 15 or 20 years ago, but the gap persists.
To compound that consolidation, there's also a phenomenon of landlords making deals with internet providers to exclusively offer that service to tenants, eliminating choice and consumers' ability to negotiate prices. This can happen even if the building is equipped to hold multiple providers.
There is actually a recent proceeding now within the Federal Communications Commission that is looking for a refresher on the record on this issue, but the case remains that they've tried to ban these exclusivity deals in the past, but providers continue to find ways to circumvent the rules with new schemes to somehow share their profits with landlords so that they will have these exclusive deals for huge apartment complexes that can have tens of hundreds of residents.
OTI points out in its report that the FCC has tried to ban these deals, but ISPs have found ways of circumventing the rules.
One thing we see is that rate regulation does offer you meaningful improvements, but it doesn't get us quite as far as competition. Now, the data suggests that competition is still the best means of improving the consumer experience. But part of the reason might be because the regulations aren't tailored to local regions, or they're not as strong as they could be.
Researchers have put forward a number of policy proposals that could increase access to high-speed internet and make prices more affordable for consumers. A top priority for many experts is providing consumers with more options.
So you encourage competition, I think, by deploying money to new providers who can build out new networks in underserved regions. You stop consolidation, I think, by taking a close look at mergers between broadband providers or mergers between broadband providers and vertically affiliated entities like content companies. We need stronger regulatory enforcement for those sorts of mergers, both at the FCC and with the antitrust authorities.
Anytime that there's a huge merger or acquisition on the books, the government can set standards. If you are a major company merging with a company that has historically provided a service for low-income households, you could keep a merger condition that would ensure that low-income households continue to have a lower price option that they can afford to stay online.
Rate regulation is also a top policy proposal among researchers.
Rate regulation can cut those prices nearly in half. Where you're served by a monopoly, rate regulation can offer you meaningful improvements in the prices you pay and the services you get. Regulation is good for consumers, but not as good as competition. It takes a long time to build out broadband networks. These are large-scale infrastructure investments. And so we need to think about what we're going to do for consumers who face high prices while we're waiting for competition to run.
There are some options when it comes to developing infrastructure at the local level. One is called municipal networks.
Municipal networks are networks that are run by cities, so operated by municipalities, and they can take a lot of different forms. Some cities partner with private companies or also utilities cooperatives to offer internet service, and others just build their own networks. In the case of cities that had both municipal and private networks, municipal networks brought down the average cost of internet in that city. They also often had some of the best speeds in the nation.
As of September 2021, at least 18 states have legislation restricting the use of municipal broadband networks, according to an analysis from Broadband Now. Industry lobbyists have argued that municipal networks can stifle private competition. Broadband activists say they're necessary to get rural residents online.
There have been reports that private companies in the area, private internet service providers, have spent thousands to millions of dollars lobbying state legislators to not allow these networks to exist. The recent infrastructure package that has been in discussion that recently passed the Senate formally had language that would have legalized these networks. That language has now been dropped, but there is legislation like the Community Broadband Act that would legalize municipal networks.
There are other policy proposals to address the inequalities, such as regulations to require service providers to be more transparent about pricing and other data.
The Federal Communications Commission allows internet service providers to self-report that data, which can lead to potential discrepancies between what people actually experience. So we definitely want to see reform on that part of data collection.
The FCC has issued rules regarding broadband transparency. It was on the path to creating what was called a broadband nutrition label, which was sort of a way of very transparently displaying, okay, here's how much you're paying, here's the speed you're going to get, here's the discounts that you have, here's how long those discounts will survive for. But these regulations can come and go with the changes of administration.
The issue of affordability affects everyone regardless of where they live, right? If you can't afford the high cost of service, you can't be online. That's whether you live in the middle of a city or you live on a farm. It doesn't matter. Cost affects everyone. So hopefully we can really make it more affordable for people.